Hey everybody, my name is Sarah. I'm the events manager here at the Booksmith. Thank you so much for coming. If you've never been here before, we have events like this all the time, so please come back. We would love to have you. We have events calendars at the door, or you can sign up for our newsletter. It's on the clipboard up front. We only use it for the newsletter. We don't sell it or do anything weird. As soon as I'm done up here, there's going to be a reading discussion for 45 minutes to an hour, depending. And then there's going to be a Q&A, so save all your questions, and they'll call on you, so it's like classroom style. After that, there'll be a signing and a chance for you to hang out and shop and get your book signed and do all that fun stuff. So I'm going to do a quick intro. We're here tonight to welcome Zach Schonfeld for his new book about Nic Cage's early years and formative performances called How Coppola Became Cage. Schonfeld is a freelance writer, journalist, and critic based in New York. He writes about culture for Pitchfork, Vulture, Spin, Pace, and many other publications. He was formerly a senior writer for Newsweek, where he was on staff for 5 years. His first book, Ghetto Misfortunes Wealth, was published in 2020 as part of the 33 and a third series. I love that. How Coppola Became Cage is his second book. And joining Zach in conversation tonight is Ned Raggett. Ned has written about music for a variety of publications over the decades, including Pitchfork as well, The Quietest Bandcamp, and KQED Arts. He lives and works in San Francisco, enjoys trying restaurants he hasn't been to before, and is the founder and co-host of By the My Water podcast, which explores the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. That is very cool. Thank you guys for being here. Nic Cage is not coming, sorry, but you're in good hands. Thank you guys so much.
Is this on? I can't tell.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure. So serving as a bit of a hype man for Zach here, the reason why I'm here is that I unfortunately, when this was a young man, when he was discovering about music, and there I am having written a lot of stuff for the All Music Guide, and he was sort of like, who's this Ned Raggett guy, and picking up on it, and I warped your taste, and I'm so sorry. but besides the many credits that Sarah was kind enough to talk about, I would like to recommend some of the work that Zach's been doing lately, even beyond his 2 books and things like that. I especially encourage you to check out much of his recent work for Stereo Gum, because among other things, and I'm going to make sure I get the names of the articles right, he's written some fantastic articles in looking at the live sort of sphere of things for music in the time now that COVID's hit. I especially recommend his 2 articles, Why Musicians Are Expected to Be Miserable on Tour, and The Curious Case of the Underselling Arena Tours, both of which are really excellent. That latter one just came out a couple of months ago. Easily the best piece I've read on the subject in recent years. You'll learn a lot from it, and I highly encourage you to do that. And if you want something fun, I should also happily recommend his interview, We've Got a File on You, with one Weird Al Yankovic, someone you might be familiar with, that just appeared a couple of weeks ago. Having said that, this particular book, as he will mention, but I will hype up a bit, I still remember when this piece came out. He wrote it for The Ringer back in 2019, and it was called, let me see if I have this right. Let me just make a look here. It's sort of like this. Jeff, here we go. Truly batshit, the secret history of Vampire's Kiss. And if you've ever seen Vampire's Kiss, you know. But any event, that's enough for me, the introduction. That's why I'm here, and I'd like to turn it over to do a reading. So put your hands together again, please, for Zach Schonfeld.
Thank you for shouting out some of the deep cuts today.
That's what I do.
I'm gonna do a brief reading from the intro of the book, and then you can all go home and read the rest on your own time. Okay, here we go. Nic Cage's first grade performance took place on a school bus in the 4th grade. He was Nicky Coppola then, a skinny kid from a troubled family, but the character he was playing went by the name of Roy Richards. Or maybe Roy Wilkinson. The name changes depending on the telling, but the gist of the tale, a treasured chestnut which Cage offered up frequently to interviewers during the early years of his career, is always the same. Cage was attending a school for juvenile delinquents after being expelled from elementary school for pranking his classmates by hiding bits of fried grasshoppers in egg salad sandwiches. On the bus to school, he was routinely beaten up by a belligerent bully who forced young Nicholas to hand over his Twinkies. One day, Cage grew tired of submitting to the bully's abuse. He devised a plan. I put on my brother's jeans and a pair of cowboy boots, slicked back my hair, and put on some shades, Cage told Playboy in a 1996 interview. I got on the bus, went up to the bully, and told him I was Roy Wilkinson, Nicky Coppola's cousin. I said, if you mess with him again, I'm gonna kick your ass. He bought it, and the next day, when I got on the bus as Nicky Coppola, he left me alone. If this were a hacky Hollywood biopic, this would be the part of the screenplay where 7 years later flashes on screen and the narrative jumps ahead to Cage in early 80s garb wandering into some audition or another. And sure, the story of 10-year-old Cage warding off a bully by sheer force of performance does seem like ready-made fodder for an Aaron Sorkin script. And yet, for all intents and purposes, Cage's acting career began on that bus. Hamming it up for an audience of one, he sensed the power of transformation and absorbed the lessons that would power his ascent to stardom. Most crucially, quote, that I could act and that there was power in being able to act. Perhaps even then, Cage, a sensitive young boy sponging up pop culture influences and ephemera swirling around him, sensed that his superpower lay in his imagination. That giving a great performance meant you had to risk looking ridiculous, barking the whole alphabet, or flipping over blackjack tables, or screaming the hokey pokey at the top of your lungs. That if your own birth-given identity wasn't working out, you could discard it and carve out a better one. Or, who knows, maybe he was just happy to keep his Twinkies.
I mean, Twinkies are important for a kid, so, I understand this, so.
Part of a balanced diet.
Yeah, exactly, so especially at that age, I know. So, anyway, there is so much that I could begin with. I don't want to simply just march through the book chronologically straight through. That would be kind of boring. So, some general questions to start with. I will actually sort of do an illustrative story. I don't remember the event, but I remember in 1999 or something like that, there was some disaster or plane thing or something like that. I forget what it was. And it was one of those things that the scenarios type thing going like, I realized this the other day when I was walking home. I'm like, oh yeah, didn't I remember thinking this. Back in 99, I was like going like, if they make the movie, it'll star Nic Cage. It was kind of that sort of thing. And I was like, why did I assume Nic Cage above all else at that time? But what's interesting, of course, is that your book specifically focuses on the early part of his career, and you end with leaving Las Vegas. Could you say more about the decision about how to focus it on that part of his career?
Yeah, I think I'm fascinated by origin stories in general, and Cage has a particularly dramatic and tumultuous origin story, being born into what soon became a Hollywood dynasty as a nephew of Francis Ford Coppola, and his own immediate family. He had a very tumultuous upbringing. His father was a literary professor who, by all accounts, was a brilliant man, but was very emotionally distant as a father. His mother suffered from pretty severe mental illness during his childhood, and Cage had quite a difficult, quite a traumatic childhood, which I felt like it had. I really wanted to delve into his early years, his childhood, and how he got his start, kind of both living in the shadow of his famous uncle, but also going to extreme lengths to break out from his uncle's shadow, obviously changing his name to Cage, being the most famous example of that. There have been, there's some other books about Nicolas Cage out there. This is not the first book ever written about him. There are some books that I think serve well as an overview of his career to date, or up to the time that these books were published. And if you want to get just like a critical overview of Nicolas Cage's whole filmography, that book already exists. I wanted to take a different approach. I felt like no one had done a book like this, just like kind of really narrowing into his early years, his formative performances. And, Cage, I think today has a reputation for being an actor who his batting average is kind of low. I mean, he's made more than his fair share of shitty movies, especially over the past, 10, 15 years. But in the 80s and in the early 90s, his filmography was really strong. I mean, he was just pumping out classic after classic. Valley Girl, Rumblefish, Peggy Sue Got Married, Moonstruck, Raising Arizona, Wild at Heart are just some, and of course Vampire's Kiss. All of those stories all of those movies had really interesting backstories behind them to delve into. And I had the sense that there was a lot of lore around Cage, especially around his early years, just a lot of like mythology and lore. Stories that had, bubbled to the surface, and you would see them mentioned, on Wikipedia or in various articles. But it was very hard to know like how much of it is true and how much of it is bullshit, because he very deliberately, and he's admitted that he very deliberately set about crafting this mythology for himself. And so reading about Cage, I would come across stories like, he swallowed a live cockroach while he was making Vampire's Kiss because he thought that would make the scene more intense. Or he had 2 of his teeth pulled out without Novocaine while he was playing a Vietnam War veteran in the film Birdie. One of those stories is true, and one of those stories is not really true. But to read it, without doing digging, it's hard to know where the mythology ends and the facts. Where do the facts end and where does the mythology begin? And I wanted to really do the work of separating myth from truth.
Right, and I will definitely say, assuming you're all going to read it, of course, have you interested? The thing that certainly strikes me is that there is a lot of a good interweaving of both commentary and interviews and things of the time, and many of the new interviews you did. There's one thing I want to follow up on that specifically. I'll get to later. But of the people who did speak to you, because of course you didn't get everywhere you want to, what was your sense about them wanting to talk about Cage? Was it sort of like, oh man, I've been wanting to get the story off my chest, but I'm glad you asked it? Did you get that vibe from a lot of people? Like they were like in on this project trying to demystify him?
I think everyone who has ever worked with Nicolas Cage has an interesting story. Mm-hmm. He really is as intense and eccentric behind the scenes as you would expect. Mm-hmm. And everyone who worked with him, especially during these formative years of his career, everyone has a story. The book was largely inspired by that piece that I wrote about Vampire's Kiss, and everyone who worked on Vampire's Kiss has a crazy story. Like the story about him swallowing a live cockroach, which was not in the script, that was his idea. Or the story about how there's a scene in Vampire's Kiss where he's attacked by a bat, and the producers were using a mechanical bat. And Cage was absolutely insistent that he needed to be attacked by a real bat. And the producers fought with him and tried to explain to him, you cannot use a real bat. You're going to get rabies. This is dangerous. We're going to get sued. And Cage was so insistent that he sent his assistant to Central Park with a broomstick to try and capture a live bat. Those are the kinds of stories that people have about Cage. And no one who I interviewed for the book was like, oh yeah, Nicolas Cage, really, really normal guy, I don't have any impression of him. Everyone had an interesting story. And so, yes, a lot of, I interviewed a number of well-known actors and directors and celebrities for the book, but I also interviewed a lot of behind-the-scenes people, a lot of casting directors and first ADs, second ADs, cinematographers, people who are not doing interviews of that nature regularly. And so I found that a lot of those people, they did have really interesting stories about Cage or about any particular whatever movie they worked on, and stories that they were eager to have the chance to share.
Okay. I had a thought, went away, I'll loop back to it, but here then maybe sort of perhaps a related question. Do you, or did you, get a sense when doing these interviews and doing the research for the people who didn't want to do that, sort of you get all this stuff, but again you have interviewed Nic Cage once some years ago, straight before one of his movies. Yeah. But that was the only time, and you indicated that you did reach out saying, hey, I'd like to, but that his manager said, sorry, things like that. Have you heard from anyone from his direction since the book came out about it?
No, but so I reached out to him multiple times while writing the book, asking to interview him, requesting to interview him, and I was always told by his manager very politely, sorry, Nick doesn't want to participate, and there was no further explanation. And so he was aware of the book, but he declined. And I never received any reason, or it was just, sorry, Nick doesn't want to participate. And they never tried to block me from writing the book. There was no animosity. It was all very cordial. And so the book, the manuscript was, the final manuscript I turned in at the beginning of 2023, and the book went through copy edits and went through proofs, and so the pre-order page went live in May of 2023, and that's when the pre-order page goes up on Amazon, that's when the book kind of becomes real, becomes official, and so I hadn't heard anything from Cage until in late May of 2023. I was at my 10-year college reunion, and my agent Barbara called me, and it was like a Saturday night, and I assumed it was like a pocket dial. I couldn't imagine why Barbara was calling me on a Saturday night in Memorial Day weekend, and it turned out that Nicolas Cage had personally emailed her requesting that she send him an advance copy of the book. And as you know, my agent Barbara, she worked with him on Vampire's Kiss, so she has that connection. She was one of the producers of Vampire's Kiss, and so Cage himself emailed my agent from an AOL.com email address, and I have this email saved on my phone if anyone wishes to hear it.
I think we do.
Yes.
I think without question.
Yes. So okay. So the context of this email is that my agent Barbara worked with Nicolas Cage 35 years ago. She produced the movie Vampire's Kiss, and they have not had any contact or no contact since more than 30 years ago. And so Cage emailed her out of the blue in May of 2023 regarding my book. And let me pull up the okay. I'm gonna try and do the voice. Dear Barbara, it's been a long time since Vampire's Kiss, and I hope you were well. I think about our time together on that set with great fondness and appreciation for your dedication to the making of that movie, which remains one of my favorites of all time. I'm writing to you to ask for an advance copy of your client, Zach Schonfeld's book, How Coppola Became Cage. By the way, congratulations on starting your own literary agency, which is very impressive. I CC'd my attorney, Brian Wolf, on this, so please send the copy to him. Best wishes, Nicolas Cage, sent from my iPhone. And it was from an AOL.com email address. And I received, my agent forwarded me that email, and it was just one of those moments where like the whole room starts spinning, and it was just like, is this real? And then I talked it over with my publisher, and we decided that under no circumstances were we going to send Nicolas Cage's lawyer the book ahead of time. Absolutely nothing good could come of his attorney scrutinizing the book before publication. So things got a little heated, and then Cage's lawyer started sending kind of aggressive emails to my publisher demanding an advance copy of the book, which they refused to send him. And so that was actually quite nerve-wracking. I was really worried that, we had absolutely no idea how Cage or his representation would respond to the book. But then the book came out in the fall, and I have not heard a thing from his camp since then.
Maybe you just read it and went like, nope, he's right. That was it. Cross fingers.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now we know. Well, Nick, if you're out there and you're seeing this video and you're doing those things, hi. But I dug very deep into his early years. I talked to a lot of people who knew him way back when, and my goal with the book really was to dig so deep into Cage's backstory and Cage's lore that if he were to read the book, he would learn things about himself that he doesn't already know. I can see that. In fact, this leads into something I was going to bring up next. Now, it was interesting to me reading some of the news reports that you summarized or cited at the time, and that actually leads to another question which I'll get to, is that some of the, let's put it simply, the tabloidy elements of his life, hey, he's got these crazy pets, etc., and all that, was already very much in place by the time he was starting to be interviewed and make a name for himself by the mid-'80s. To my mind, that almost seemed like something that was more after his flush years and like at the turn of the century and all that. So that was that surprising to you? Because it was kind of surprising to me. It's sort of like, oh wow, he's just maybe always been like this. So
Yeah, the eccentricity was there from the beginning. The $20 million paychecks, which he used to buy up, scores of mansions and castles in Europe, those were not there from the beginning.
Right.
But he's always had a thing for exotic pets. And in the mid-'80s, he moved into a large apartment in, forgetting the name of the apartment complex, the El Royale apartment complex in Hollywood. And when he didn't do many interviews, he was kind of uncomfortable with press, but when he did do interviews, he would invite journalists over to his apartment in the El Royale, and he would show off his exotic fish and his shark. He had a pet shark, literally a pet shark, swimming around in a shark tank in his living room. And he had an octopus, and he had a pet monkfish. And so every profile of Cage from 1986 or 1987, they all kind of open with, Nicolas Cage is introducing me to his pet octopus. The octopus is angry at Cage and just squirted black ink all over his fingers. And Cage was I think he was very eager to show off his exotic side, his, kind of wacky hobbies and his bizarre pets. He also owned a pet lizard at one point. He was really into sharks. He had sharks for a while. And a few years later, I came across a tabloid clipping, I think from Page 6, this was from the early 90s, saying that he and his then girlfriend were being sued by the rental agents of his apartment because the shark tanks had overflowed and caused like a really bad flooding. And apparently it caused thousands of dollars in damage. So yes, if you are taking care of sharks in a Hollywood apartment, this is just something to keep in mind.
Plenty of people. But sort of related to that, the way the book goes, which I thought was very smart, is that while you do occasionally look ahead or cite moments that are further beyond the book's scope, I think, speaking frankly, one of the best qualities of the book is that you don't operate from the point of view of just looking back going like, see the roots of how everything came from. It's more sort of a sense of this is where he was at this particular time, and nobody knows the future yet, which I think is the best approach for that. Because it's all too easy to just basically say like, oh, of course he was always going to win an Oscar and become a huge star and all the rest of it. Whereas, especially in the 80s as it goes, and obviously early on, there's this real sense that he doesn't always know what he's going to be doing next and all that. In fact, that seems to crop up a fair amount throughout his career, but especially in the 80s. Now, could you say more about the relationship in particular on this, as well as connection with his, I'm sorry, I forget his name, his initial agent of note, the one that he worked with for about 10 years.
And Lamato.
That was it, yeah. Because that seems to be sort of like, it seems to be the classic sort of case of, what do I do, how do I do this? And an agent looking after you going like, you're going to try this, let's get you on this picture. And it seems like as often as they were simpatico, sometimes they were logging, at loggerheads.
Yeah, Ed Lamato was a very old school, big shot Hollywood agent who was very focused on, he represented some of the biggest artists of the time. He represented Richard Gere and Kevin Costner, and he represented a young Nicolas Cage. And Cage had, I think, a somewhat contentious relationship with his agent Ed Lamato, because Ed Lamato was always trying to steer him to more mainstream projects. And Cage has talked about how Cage did not want to do Moonstruck. Cage was very opposed to Moonstruck. He thought it was too cheesy, too lovey-dovey, and his agent Lamato was like, "This movie's going to be a hit. You really need to do it." And Cage wanted to do Vampire's Kiss, a low budget black comedy directed by a first-time director about man who goes insane and believes he's turning into a vampire. Very, very dark, very non-commercial film. And his agent, Ed Lamato, was like, absolutely not. Like, you're not doing this, fucked up vampire movie. And so Cage made a deal with his agent, I will do Moonstruck if you let me do Vampire's Kiss. And so it was like a one for them, one for me type of situation. And I think that's pretty revealing of his relationship with Lamato. My understanding is that Lamato, in the 90s, Lamato kept trying to steer Cage to these more mainstream comedies, which Cage tried for a while, but none of them were really, you know, he did Honeymoon in Vegas, and he did It Could Happen to You. He tried to present a more mainstream family-friendly image, and it wasn't really quite a fit for him. And shortly after that, he parted ways with his longtime agent, Lamada, and he signed with Richard Lovett. So he definitely, yeah, he had a complicated relationship with his agent. I think his agent kind of thought that Cage was pretty nuts.
And he's has Lamato passed on?
He has.
Okay,
So I was obviously not able to speak with him for the book. I
right.
would have loved to have been able to get his recollections. But
You touched on this already, but maybe delving a little deeper, since it does seem to be incredibly key to a lot of his self-image and trying to make his name, and that is, you know, summed up in the title of the book, that he was a Coppola who didn't want to be a Coppola at a certain point, or basically realized that sort of like, oh, if I'm going to come out and do this, everyone's going to immediately put me in a box and assume that I either got Jobs Coast connections or see me through that lens. And you speak about that in some detail about what we know of his decisions and why he did this and what related to that. And related to that, of course, is also not merely the fact that he has appeared for a stretch of movies for his uncle, Francis Ford, through the 80s, but also his cousin, Christopher Coppola, who...
Chris is his brother.
His brother,
Yeah.
excuse me. So
Yes.
I'm sorry, I got the relationship.
That was okay, yeah.
But also that too, and the other connections, and you speak more about like, you know, family visits and other things like that, and much more besides which I could go on about. I'd rather offer up to you. But is it your impression? I mean, you certainly lay it out. It seems like if there's a central driving thing about his relationship to fame and stature, really does come down to that. Like, it's something that he basically. Do you think he still wars with it? Is it still very important to him? Do you think, or?
I think now he's certainly established his own identity, but
Right.
in his early years, he had a lot of angst about living in his uncle's shadow, and everyone knew him as Francis Ford Coppola's nephew, and he had this like really burning desire to set himself apart from his family name and to be his own, you know, to establish himself as a star in his own right. And even when he was a child, I mean, he talks about how when he was like 13 or 14, he spent a summer living at Francis's house here in San Francisco. And obviously at that time, Francis had become very wealthy and was living in quite an exorbitant house. And Cage had come from somewhat of a more modest family. And young Nicholas, he talks about how he was just fuming with jealousy that his cousins lived a much more extravagant lifestyle than he did. And he was jealous that his uncle had achieved all this fame. And he remembers as a kid thinking to himself, like, someday I'm gonna get even, I'm gonna achieve all this for myself. I'm gonna be able to buy, you know, a mansion in San Francisco on my own terms, and he did. He achieved that. So it was very early in his career that he changed his name to Cage. The only movie that he did under his birth name was Fast Times.
That's right. Yes, and he was meant to be the Judge Reinhold role. Was that right?
He was. Yeah, he auditioned for the Judge Reinhold role, and thought he was going to get it, and then he didn't get it, and so they gave him pretty much a bit part as a consolation prize.
Mm-hmm.
And they're contradictory stories as to why he didn't get the big part. There's some. It has been said over the years that he was 17 at the time of filming, so he was underage, so they couldn't work with him enough hours because of child labor laws. But when I interviewed the director, Amy Heckerling, she said that wasn't true because he actually lied about his age, and he told her that he was 18.
Of course.
But that was, yes, he was very, very upset that he didn't get the big part.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also very upset that when he was on set for Fast Times at Ridgemont High, some of the other actors were teasing him for being a Coppola. And they were, apparently, the line that they were using on him was, "I love the smell of Nicholas in the morning." And so he was very angsty about people teasing him for being a Coppola, and it was very shortly afterwards that he changed his name to Cage.
All right, I'd like to now move on to some of the more movie specifics and key roles, but before we sort of march through that a bit, I wanted to touch lightly on one of the other fascinating things I found about the book was you digging up these details of these films I had never heard of in my life. And I was like, what? And one of the ones that just sort of blew my mind is apparently this cheesy sports drama, The Boy in Blue.
Yeah.
What's the story of this one again exactly?
This was a Canadian biopic about Cage plays a rowing champion from the late 1800s, and this was like the first and last sports movie that Cage ever did. He had a miserable time. It was just like a very boilerplate, bland biopic, and he's shirtless for much of the movie, and he had to like really get into shape to play the character, and he was very uncomfortable with basically being reduced to like a beefcake type of shirtless hunk in that movie, and the movie flopped. It got terrible reviews, deservedly so, and I think you could argue that his negative experience on that. I mean, this was quite early in his career. This movie was filmed in '84. It came out in '86. His negative experience doing this like pretty bland boilerplate biopic is part of what drove him to seek out much more eccentric and abrasive roles shortly after that. So that it was right after that he did Peggy Sue Got Married and Raising Arizona, and then later Vampire's Kiss. He really had this need to set himself apart from anything in Hollywood that was cliched or boilerplate or by the numbers. He really needed to. He was really eager to seek out the most depraved characters possible for a while.
We'll see, keeping on the time, we'll see how many of sort of the big ones I get to do that talk here, but quite possibly some of you have questions about some of the films I might not get to, so feel free to ask if I don't touch on that. But starting with, it sounds like the key role for him early on was Valley Girl, playing the lead there. Was something that's like, here you see very much the lead character, an incredibly smart, funny movie still that absolutely holds up, and it's almost sort of like there's a Nicolas Cage that is a conventional leading man based on this movie from this point forward. Although of course it doesn't quite work out that way. Still though, it's a remarkable film then and now. From your perspective as someone who, let's face it, wasn't around when it happened, although I was 12, I remember the song being on the radio. What's your read on looking at Cage at that point right then and there? What is he like? What does it sort of suggest to you as an actor, as a figure down the way?
I mean, you're correct that I wasn't born yet, and so I didn't experience the Valley Girl phenomenon firsthand. So for me, the movie is like a historical artifact. And
thank you for making me feel old.
You're welcome. And it's a historical artifact because this is Nicolas Cage's first starring role. So this was like the breakout performance for him. And as I recount the whole story in my book of how this was the first movie he auditioned for under his new name of Cage, and the director, Martha Coolidge, had no idea that he was Francis's nephew, despite the fact that she had worked with Francis at Zoetrope. So this was like his big shot to prove himself on his own terms, and he nailed it. I mean, he aced it. He was cast in, I think, a perfect role for 18-year-old Nicolas Cage, playing this rebellious young punk from Hollywood who seduces the Valley Girl love interest, and I think the movie gave him a chance to tap into like two big sides of his persona. Like one, the dangerous, rebellious kind of punk character, but also the romantic side. It's also very much a romantic movie, and he does the gooey, romantic eyes and facial expressions, and the makeout scene. He has definitely a lot of romantic charm in that movie, and he had a lot of swagger. I mean, the producer of Valley Girl told me that they auditioned a whole bunch of young actors for that part, and Nicolas Cage and Judd Nelson, of all actors who auditioned, Cage and Judd Nelson, were the only two who could look a girl in the eye and say, "I want to fuck you," and make it sound believable. And Cage, he was 18. He'd never starred in a movie before. And Martha Coolidge, the director, she really went to bat for him. She really fought for him to get that role. And in the studio, it was produced by a very small film studio, and they were very skeptical of him. They didn't want him to. They wanted it to go to a more conventional type of heartthrob.
And let's see, so after that, there's sort of this interesting, I realize now, when I was reading the book, I'm like, oh yeah, that film, like more than once, because I just remember this vaguely from ads on TV. I was in middle school at the time, but I do remember things like Racing with the Moon. I remember hearing about Birdie, hearing about them rather than seeing them, but I remember them coming out, and sort of the stretch of sort of in my mind, oh, that's like adult films. Again, I was like 13. So, it's just sort of this is what my parents go see or things like that. But sort of skipping ahead from that, again, that's sort of a path that's sort of like, okay, this is a conventional-ish path where he can be an intense method actor, but these are films that sort of are like, okay, all right. But then you brought these two films up already, then things start to shift in very interesting directions, and particularly with Raising Arizona, which you attended the screening of last night at the 4-Star Theater. Okay. That whole chapter was a revelation. It's one of those things that for me, that's the first film I remember that he was in, that I remember I hadn't connected him with the movie, but I remember the movie. I remember the ads being out, going in the ads on TV and going man, this looks great and all that, but I hadn't sunk in that there was this Nic Cage guy involved. And you just saw it again last night. I thought your description of it as a live-action Warner Brothers cartoon is, on the one hand, a perfect example of what the Coens are in their own wonderful, weird world when they decide to do something. On the other hand, what a perfect choice of actor to do this role.
Yeah, and what I found surprising about Raising Arizona is that the Coens were very skeptical of him. They newly cast Kevin Costner in that role. It came down to Cage and Kevin Costner.
I cannot believe Kevin Costner in that film as himself. That just doesn't work.
Can't see him doing it. This was a phase of Cage's career where he had become very bored with realism, and he wanted, he felt like realism was a limited approach to film performances, and he felt like he needed to do something else, to bring a totally different energy to his performances. And so in Raising Arizona, I describe it as being a live-action cartoon, and in fact, Cage's performance was heavily inspired by Woody Woodpecker. And his hair, the way his hair sticks up. If you watch the film, you'll notice that the more stressed out his character is, the more wild his hair is. And the action scenes where he's being chased by the pack of wild dogs, it has a very cartoonish, almost Looney Tunes quality to it. I think it's just an example of how Cage thrives when he works with directors who are daring and inventive enough to depart from the confines of realism and bring a more surreal or a more cartoonish energy to filmmaking. During this period of his career, every movie that he did, he was just channeling like a wildly different source of inspiration. When he did Peggy Sue Got Married, he spends his entire performance in that movie delivering his lines in this nasally, high-pitched voice that was modeled after the talking claymation horse from the show Gumby. And so all of his lines in that movie are like, how's it going, Peggy Sue? And the cast had no idea what the hell he was doing. They thought that he was just messing around and he wasn't actually going to do that in the final take. And so then he did Raising Arizona, and he was channeling like Looney Tunes and Woody Woodpecker. And then after that, he did Moonstruck. And Moonstruck is very inspired by opera. And I think you could argue that the tone of the movie and the heightened monologues and the emotions are very operatic. And then right after Moonstruck, he did Vampire's Kiss. And in Vampire's Kiss, he was drawing on silent cinema and German expressionist films from the 1920s. He was particularly his body language in the movie, his like weird expressionistic movements were very inspired by Max Schreck in the original Nosferatu.
Mm-hmm.
So he was always channeling something that he hadn't channeled before, and he was always kind of keeping audiences and critics a little bit confounded because no one really understood what exactly he was on. I mean, I think people thought that he was just going rogue and he was just kind of like behaving like a lunatic on these film sets. But there was always some influence that he had in mind that he was trying to bring to those performances. There was always something in his brain that he was trying to channel on screen.
Mm-hmm. There's certainly more I could bring up about some of the films you just discussed. I will say that offhand that Peggy Sue Got Married is the first time I remember going like, oh, there's an actor called Nic Cage and he's in this film. It's sort of like, got it. Sort of like that for me is my starting point, like, okay, I will remember this guy.
And what was your impression of him?
Your description of the voice is fairly accurate and all that. So, but I mean, that was another case too. Speaking from my point of view, you bring this up in the book. It comes out around the same time as a certain film called Back to the Future, of which a few people might have heard. And I remember at the time people were like, oh, it's the adult version of it, meaning it is the one for the adults. And my parents are big fans, and big fans of Raising Arizona too. They are cage heads in their own way. So depending on the movie. Let's see. So keeping an eye on the time, we still have some space to discussion. We'll throw it open for questions here in about 10 minutes or so. A few things to note or stress on. We could talk more about other movies, but again, keeping on the time, let's move ahead to the 90s and sort of the run-up to leaving Las Vegas. You mentioned Honeymoon in Vegas, speaking of Vegas, and of course, there is such a thing as a Nic Cage Vegas trilogy you can make in the 90s, if you're talking about Honeymoon in Vegas, leaving Las Vegas, and then eventually Beyond Scope of Con Air. Although it did occur to me, I will throw this out there. Imagine if it was Nic Cage in the Kyle MacLachlan role in Showgirls. Because that would... Some people are with me on this. I heard that laugh.
Yeah.
You know that film. I think that would have been pretty interesting, him and Verhoeven.
Cage has a kind of cosmic connection to Las Vegas. He lives in Las Vegas full time now. And there's a quote where he kind of explains his connection to Vegas, which I'd like to find in the book. He says, "I've made very good movies in Las Vegas. There is a genius Loki that is a good match for me in Las Vegas." And Vegas is where he lives today. So clearly he's very drawn to Vegas.
Very drawn to it. I will briefly before
apparently he lives right near Pauly Shore in Vegas. And they run into each other quite regularly.
Your neighbors are your neighbors. I guess what happens is, why wouldn't Pauly Shore end up there? Before I get to the last couple questions, a quick mention. I was really fascinated to learn about the film, and this is a very much an incredible word of mouth film. That was Red Rock West, and how it just sort of like. I still remember hearing about the 90s, like, have you heard about this Nicolas Cage film that was all the first on HBO? I'm like, what are you talking about? And then it was like, people watch it go like, really fascinating. And I was really interested to learn that it was the Roxy Theater here in San Francisco that was key to it actually getting a theatrical release.
Yeah, Red Rock West, I have to admit that I'd never seen it before starting work on this book. And part of why I'd never seen it is because it's just not on streaming at all. It's just one of those movies where the rights have fallen into disarray, and it's not available on any streaming platforms. And so the way that I tracked it down, I had to rent the DVD from Netflix because until quite recently I was still getting DVDs in the mail from Netflix. And yeah, so I watched Red Rock West and I was blown away by how good that film is. It really is a fantastic film. I think Cage delivers a more subdued, more quieter kind of performance in Red Rock West, and he's going up against Dennis Hopper playing a complete psychopath. So they really balance each other out. And that is, that movie is just one of those deep cuts in Cage's career that does not get talked about nearly as much as it should. It's just a phenomenal film.
Right, yeah. No, if you haven't seen it, take the time. It's really remarkable. So the book, your book crescendos, if you will, leaving Las Vegas. You know, as you said, I'm kind of asked to, and something that struck me about the time. And these days, it's sort of like, oh yeah, it was the big Oscar-winning film, and he was the one who won the Oscar for it. Fantastic. I hadn't realized how much of a scrappy production it was. It seemed like it barely existed until like Mike Figgis and people pulled together things. It seemed like it shouldn't have happened. That was kind of remarkable to me.
Yeah, it was a low-budget movie. I think a $3.5 million budget, and from what I understand, no major studio in Hollywood was willing to get involved with it because of how dark and how bleak the screenplay was. And so I think the movie was financed by some independent producer in France, and Cage worked for scale. He was paid far, well below his normal fee at that time. And he's talked about many times how when he read the screenplay, he was so moved by it that he started crying, and he really felt this almost like supernatural kinship with the author of the book Leaving Las Vegas, John O'Brien, who tragically died by suicide right after selling the rights, right after selling the movie rights. So there was kind of a tragic backstory to the making of the movie. And Cage, so Cage was in a phase of his career at this time where he'd done a string of kind of mainstream Hollywood comedies. It Could Happen to You, Guarding Tess, and then the last of those comedies was Trapped in Paradise, which is frankly a dreadful movie. Do not seek it out. And Cage, he'd been trying to establish himself as more of a mainstream, like family-friendly comedy star, and it wasn't really working out for him. And he'd become really frustrated with feeling like he was compromising his true self in order to do these more family-friendly movies. And so he was really, I think he was really thirsting for a more depraved, kind of dark role that he could really pour his heart and soul into, and that was the mindset that he was in when he read Leaving Las Vegas, and he immediately called up the director Mike Figgis and said, I really want to do this part, like don't offer it to anyone else, I will find a way to make it work. Once again, his agent thought he was nuts, his representatives thought he was nuts for doing a movie of that nature, but he really poured all of himself into that performance. He's obviously, the character that he's playing is an alcoholic who has given up on his life and has essentially decided to move to Las Vegas and drink himself to death. And at the very beginning of filming, Cage approached the director Mike Figgis and said, I have an idea. I want to be pissed drunk every day while we're filming this movie. Like I'm just gonna be drunk the entire time, and it'll be more authentic that way. And Mike Figgis was like, absolutely not. There's no way that's gonna work. We need you to be on time. This is we don't have time for reshoots. We need you to be ready to go. Absolutely fucking not. And Cage mostly adhered to his director's wishes, but there is one scene in a casino where the character is thrown out of a casino, and he kind of has a meltdown, and he throws the blackjack table over. And in that scene, Cage really was shit-faced. Mm-hmm. And he also hired a drinking coach to accompany him on set. So
you don't need to hire it.
This was a family friend of the Coppola family named Tony Dingman, who was a poet and a self-described drunken poet, longtime alcoholic, and he had known Nicholas since he was a young boy. And so Cage basically hired Tony Dingman to hang out in his trailer all day, just taking down shots, getting wasted, and Cage would observe Tony's behavior and would observe how he carried himself, how he spoke when he was drunk, and some of the wacky lines, some of the lines that Cage delivers in Leaving Las Vegas, when he's at the biker bar and he's hitting on that biker woman, and he's saying all this wacky stuff to her, like you do not kick the bar, you lean into the bar. All of that was stuff that he took from Tony Dingman, which is stuff that Tony Dingman was muttering to himself while shit-faced in Nick's trailer.
Good answer.
And so when he won the Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas, one of the first people who he thanked during his acceptance speech was his drinking coach.
You know, credit where credit is due. So.
I believe this is the only Oscar acceptance speech in Academy Award history to thank a drinking coach.
How unique. One last question for me, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. Basically, we'll move beyond the bounds of the book now to sort of the present day with Cage. You do speak briefly about his, what's the name of that film? The Unbearable Talent.
Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent.
Thank you. Which I like more than you did. I think, frankly, he and Pedro Pascal should do a buddy movie together, something else and all that. They were fantastic, great chemistry. But if we're looking at him right at the present day, of course, he is currently in a film that's gotten a fair amount of attention, Longlegs, playing a wonderfully fascinating, creepy character, and things like. And you wrote about that for Slate.
For The Ringer.
The Ringer, okay. And so your thoughts on like where he is now with roles like that, and still like being a draw. He's listed one of the 2 key stars.
I think is excellent. I mean, I started this project way back in 2019, and at that time, Cage was not in a very good place in his career. He was working nonstop, pumping out 4 or 5 movies a year, essentially to pay off all of his real estate debts that he had incurred, basically buying up mansions and castles in Germany and England and buying a private island in the Bahamas. He was working to pay off his debts, and he'd fallen on hard times, and his reputation had taken a real hit, and most of the movies that he was pumping out were not up to his standards as an actor. So during, while I was in the throes of writing the book back in 2021, 2022, he really entered this career revival with Pig. I think Pig is a great film, and when that movie came out, I was really taken aback by how great he is in it, and how it really gave him a chance to, I guess, reintroduce himself to audiences and remind critics of how great he is. And it's interesting, for many years when people asked him what's your favorite movie he's ever done, he would say Vampire's Kiss. And in recent interviews, he started saying Pig is his favorite movie he's ever done. So that was a real comeback moment for him. And then after Pig, he did The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, which, as you know, I'm not a fan of that movie, but it certainly was a high-profile movie that got a lot of attention and helped reboot his career and bring him back to the attention of mainstream audiences. And since then, he's done Dream Scenario, which I thought was pretty good, and he got a Golden Globe nomination. And now he's in Longlegs, which is shaping up to be kind of the buzzy horror movie of the year. And his performance is really pretty creepy and pretty sinister, and also darkly hilarious. This is all very fortuitous for me that he's experiencing this comeback. It's all very, very convenient for me personally, but it's also just on a fan level. I'm really pleased to see that Cage has entered a whole new phase of his career. He's getting roles that are juicier and more interesting than the roles that he was getting for quite a while there in the 2010s decade.
Yeah, very true. Okay, so we want to open it up to Q&A at this point. 2 things to keep in mind. First, for recording purposes, when you say your question, I will be repeating it into the microphone just to make sure it's properly captured, or at least summing it up. The other thing to note is, please, if you have a comment, talk to him at this book signing and leave it to them. We want to hear questions, please, and if you keep it focused, even better. That way we get a chance to hear from anybody. So, throwing it open, who has an initial question? Anybody? You right there. Go ahead.
You mentioned Longlegs, and I remember, I don't personally like his performance in that movie because I think the rest of it is so mannered and very formal, and it's Oz Perkins style, that he kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. But there was a recent interview with Oz Perkins where he was talking about, like, when you get Nicolas Cage, he compared it to going into like a cage with a lion as a lion tamer, where he's like, you have a whip and you have a chair, but like really the lion's going to do whatever it's going to do. And so my question is, having worked with really directors with really strong visions across like a wide range of genres, from the Coens to his uncle to Martin Scorsese and like Michael Bay. Do you think that as his stature has grown and as his image has kind of calcified, that he is working with people who don't challenge him as much or don't give him as much pushback?
I would definitely, yeah. Over the last 15 years, Cage has done a lot of indie movies, a lot of like straight to VOD movies that no one has heard of, movies that barely got any attention. And in a lot of these cases, he's working with young directors, first-time directors. And Cage being attached to the movie is basically what gets these movies distribution. And so Cage has a long leash, no pun intended, to do whatever the hell he wants. And so yeah, I think he has a lot of creative control over these movies. But also, like, I think the best directors that he works with are directors who are willing to like go to some weird places with him, willing to like accept some wacky ideas from him, but also are not afraid to like say no, because a director's job is to, you know, direct the actor and make creative decisions and rein the actor in if their performance isn't working properly. I mean, to give an example, he seemed to have a really good working relationship with David Gordon Green in the movie Joe, which is like one of the few genuinely good movies that he made in the 2010s, and one of the few that got some good critical reception. And yeah, I mean, David Gordon Green in interviews has talked about how, like, you know, Cage came to set with a lot of crazy ideas, and sometimes he had to say no. And there was one scene where Cage had this idea that he thought that his character should be naked in his backyard playing the flute. And David Gordon Green was like, no, there's no reason for you to be naked playing the flute. And so that didn't make it into the movie. But then there are other examples where Cage does have some interesting ideas. For instance, in The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, which for anyone who hasn't seen it, this is the movie where Cage plays a fictionalized version of himself. And in that film, there's this recurring gag where the fictionalized Cage is really obsessed with silent films from the 1920s, and he's driving his daughter crazy because he keeps trying to force her to watch The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And that element, like, that's very true to Cage. Cage is really obsessed with German expressionistic films from the 20s, and that was his idea, to bring that element of himself into the script. And obviously the director went for it. Yeah, I think directors give him a lot of leeway, especially now.
Yeah.
Especially now that he is who he is. Maybe not so much in the 90s when he was working with Scorsese and Brian De Palma, but
You reminded me of something I was actually going to ask earlier, just to throw in. Has he ever directed himself or directed anybody? Has he ever actually directed?
he has directed one and only one movie. It's the movie Sunny. Sunny was a 2002 drama film starring James Franco as a male prostitute. And James Franco's mom is his pimp. It's kind of a cursed movie, to be completely honest with you.
It sounds like it.
The movie did not do well. It was ridiculed by critics. It's the first and only time that Cage ever directed. And it's he's not, based on that movie, he's not as provocative as a director as he is an actor, but he does have one brief cameo in the film, I guess the only time he's ever directed himself, in which he plays a flamboyant cocaine-snorting pimp named Acid Yellow. And it's probably one of the wackiest performances he's ever done, and obviously he gave himself the leeway as a director of the film to go completely off his gourd. The movie didn't do well. He's never directed another feature film ever after that. But he is very active as a producer. He has his own production company, Saturn Films, and he has a producer credit on a lot of the movies that he stars in.
Oh, okay. Next question, anybody? Yes, right there.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. When you talk about him like resisting his family name, literally, it feels like a bygone era of nepo babies in Hollywood, because I feel like nowadays, whenever I hear about some young person, I always find out that they're related to someone in Hollywood.
Yeah.
But this was a practice that happened a decent amount with like Emilio Estevez and people like that. And I wanted to know what your story about how Coppola Became Cage, like speaks to, like, do you feel like there is a difference between how children of people in the industry bear that weight now, or that he was just so idiosyncratic in the way that he did it? Or do you think that there's a lesson in Nic Cage's story for nepo babies of Hollywood today? I guess is the way
The nepo baby question.
I mean, I think that Wikipedia has made it very easy to just like look up Maude Apatow and like immediately find out who her dad is. Perhaps it wasn't quite as easy back in like 1982, but Cage, I mean, he wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to distance himself from his famous uncle. He wanted to have his own name, his own identity. But at the same time, he did star in 3 of Francis Ford Coppola's films very early in his career, which is an opportunity that's not available to most young actors in that time. And eventually, in Peggy Sue Got Married, he gave such a wacky performance that Francis Ford Coppola never wanted to work with him ever again. But that's another story. But yeah, he wanted to have his cake and eat it too. I mean, he very much wanted to distance himself from the Coppola family and prove that he could make it on his own. But at the same time, he benefited very obviously from being the nephew of Francis Ford Coppola. And that did help him get his start and help him get some of his earliest roles. I think today, I mean, the like discussion around nepo babies is just like very, very accelerated by social media and by Wikipedia, and people can just like look up who's related to whom. And yeah, I've noticed that some of these actors who are nepo babies have started to get very testy about being asked about it in interviews. Like I think it was who was it? Was it Ethan Hawke's daughter Maya Hawke who was like, oh yeah, like I auditioned for that film just like anyone. I auditioned for my father's film just like anyone else would. It's like, okay, like you're Maya Hawke.
And next question, anybody? Yes, right there.
Yeah, I wonder if you have a perspective, like, I always liked him but didn't follow his career obsessively or anything. And there seemed to be a point where he was doing like good, big movies, in the 2000s, like, he was in Matchstick Men and stuff, like things that did all right. And then it sort of turned into, big schlock, like Knowing, was it called, or whatever?
Yeah.
Was there a turning point that you can pinpoint where it's like, here was his last good movie for a while, or here was his first big flop? Like, what tipped him over the edge from being like the Con Air guy to being like the guy in the Fighting Witches with a Sword movie?
I think it happened gradually. I would definitely pinpoint the late aughts, early 2010s as like the moment where his career really took a dive, and I don't know if it's his fault or his agent's fault, but he just made terrible decisions about which movies to do. I mean, Knowing wasn't really good. Bangkok Dangerous was terrible reviews. Around this time, he did a movie called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which was just a god-awful movie. And then after that, he did Season of the Witch, Drive Angry, and the second, the Ghost Rider sequel, which I personally think is one of the most awful movies he's ever done, just an unwatchable dreck. That is really where his career just like went down the toilet, and it just so happened that era coincided with the housing market crash, and so he had bought up all of these mansions and castles, castles in Romania, castles in Germany, and all of a sudden he was no longer getting the kinds of big roles that he'd been getting. He wasn't, getting $20 million paychecks anymore, and his finances really went down the toilet, and he was in trouble for quite a few years. And so what happened after that is that his reputation went downhill. He was no longer getting high-profile studio movies, and he just started like pumping out these straight to VOD movies for a while, and some of them are decent, but most of them are pretty range from mediocre to terrible.
I seem to remember there's one of them where you mentioned in the book that he's playing a version of a character that died in an earlier film and somehow is now back to life.
Yeah, so that is the movie Arsenal, in which Cage reprises the character who he previously played in the 1993 film Deadfall, which was the only film of his that's directed by his older brother Christopher Coppola. And Deadfall was directed by Cage's older brother, and it was kind of a Coppola family project because their aunt Talia Shire also has a role in the film, and it's a kind of a like a 90s neo-noir type of movie, fairly straightforward, except that Cage is like acting like he's on a different planet than every other cast member in the film. I mean, this is a movie in which like he has a wildly different accent in every scene, and he delivers many of his lines just like barking his lines in a like a gruff voice, sounding like Andy Kaufman's alter ego Tony Clifton, and he wears this like brown toupee and disgusting like porno-esque mustache, and he wears sunglasses throughout the film. And the famous scene from that film, which you may have seen in some of the Nicolas Cage losing his shit supercuts, is a scene in which he is having a meltdown in a strip club, and there's easily the best scene in Deadfall is when he's like walking through the strip club and he's getting really angry and he just screams, "Fuck!" And it just goes on for like nine seconds. And long story short, his relationship with his older brother who directed that movie has not been the same ever since. They have had a strained relationship, and his brother kind of, I think, has some anger at Cage for doing with that movie what he wanted to do and taking it in some really really extreme directions. And so yes, spoiler alert, halfway through Deadfall, Cage's character dies by having his head slammed into a deep fryer. He literally gets fried to death.
Was that Christopher Coppola trying to do a bit of documentary filmmaking there?
And then about 25 years later, in a movie called Arsenal, Cage decided to reprise the same character who he played in Deadfall, and there's just never explained, like, how is it that this character died in the previous film and now he's alive again? They just completely sidestepped that continuity issue. minor continuity issue. The character died, but now he's back.
Minor details. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Yes.
You briefly touched on this before, but 2 years ago, when Cage gave a cover profile to GQ, talking about his renewed life in Las Vegas, he repeatedly referred to himself as the California Klaus Kinski. It's well documented that he reveres German expressionism and Kinski in particular. But in your research, what did you find, or was there anything really that struck you about his relationship to or his reverence for Kinski or expressionist filmmaking?
Well, yeah. I don't know exactly what he meant by that Klaus Kinski comment, but Cage did obviously work with Werner Herzog in Bad Lieutenant, which, speaking of one of the few truly great movies that he made during that rough stretch of his career, Cage is obsessed with German expressionist films from the 20s, and Cage's dad, August Coppola, was a literature professor who introduced Cage to a lot of like old art movies when Cage was very young, and that definitely had a formative impact on young Nicholas. And so Cage, especially early in his career, Cage would frequently talk about how he was inspired by the movement style of German expressionist films from the 1920s, and the way that actors like Max Schreck and Lon Chaney would basically deliver these very very grotesque, high contrast, expressionistic movements, especially Max Schreck in Nosferatu, which is the first on-screen portrayal of Dracula. Cage was very influenced by all these like larger-than-life expressionistic body movements, and he really wanted to try to tap into that kind of energy in modern, obviously, sound filmmaking. I mean, the big takeaway is that Cage, he really is just a movie nerd at heart. That's who he is. He loves watching old movies, talking about old movies, and taking inspiration from old movies. I think he's just a true cinephile, and that is something that became very clear to me over the course of researching this book.
One more question we have time for. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? Anyone? Sure. Yeah. Oh, okay. No, wait. Hey, you hadn't asked a question before, right?
Yeah. So
Okay. Yeah. Go.
kind of a theme of the book is that there's a number of directors that he has said he's enjoyed working with. The director said he enjoyed working with them, but they never worked together again. Is there a director Cage pairing that you would be most excited to see if it came out billing, in the future?
Yes. Paul Thomas Anderson. I'd love to see him work with Paul Thomas Anderson. The one and only time that I interviewed Nicolas Cage was in 2015 for Newsweek. And one of the questions that I asked him was, what's a director that you have never worked with before who you really want to work with? And he gave me two answers, Quentin Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson, two directors who he has never worked with. I know that Tarantino is a big fan of Valley Girl, and I mentioned in the book that Tarantino was 20 years old when Valley Girl came out and was profoundly influenced by it. So those are two collaborations that I would kill to see, especially now that Cage is finally getting more high-profile roles again. I feel like Paul Thomas Anderson needs to hurry up and give him a call.
It's funny you should say that because I remember thinking to myself, speaking of someone who's worked with Paul Thomas Anderson a couple times, it's sort of like, is Joaquin Phoenix the quietly more like scrubbed up, mean streaming version of Cage now in a weird sort of way? But that's maybe a subject for another time. So, but
I think there's something to that theory.
There could be something there. Yeah, it's kind of a hunch.
Another director I'd love to see him work with is Noah Baumbach. I was doing a podcast interview, not a podcast, a print interview recently, and the guy who was interviewing me mentioned that Noah Baumbach and Cage actually have something in common, where they were both raised by academic dads, and they both clearly have a lot of daddy issues that they kind of pour into their movies. Baumbach's dad was also an English professor and kind of a frustrated novelist, and Cage had a similar background. And so I feel like so many of Baumbach's movies are just kind of like reckoning with the weird trauma of being raised by narcissistic, writer parents, and I think that's something that Cage would probably jive with.
And maybe on that note, given on the time, we should wrap up here. So thank you very much for coming out around here.